Okay, we are moving on to the special interview to ISSB Chair Emmanuel Faber, a path to global baseline, economic progress, and looking ahead. The interviewer is Ms. Keiko Tashiro, Trustee of IFRS Foundation. So, Ms. Tashiro, if you'd please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to be able to introduce you to Emmanuel Faber, who I believe right now is one of the hottest people on the global seminar circuit. So
I certainly have the hottest seat. I don't know if I'm the hottest person, but
So just to give everybody a short description of Emmanuel, who is the inaugural chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board since January 2022. He's well known for placing sustainability at the heart of business strategy. And prior to being where he is right now as the ISSB chair, he held leadership positions in multinational food products company Danone for 20 years. And I'm sure lots of people know the great jobs that he'd done there, during which he notably served as CEO from 2014 and as well chair of the board from 2017 to 2021. So I am going to shoot questions at you straight away because I think that's what everybody wants me to do. And I will start with a very simple question of what have you been up to in Japan these few days?
thank you, Keiko. That's indeed probably one of the simplest questions, I guess. We've been here with the full board of trustees of the foundation, chaired by Erkki Liikanen and a number of our colleagues here, for, I think, a meeting that hadn't taken place in Japan for 6 years, if I'm correct. So it's a great way for the foundation to reconnect with the geography. Andreas Barkov, the chair of ISSB, has been there, of course, more recently. I had the pleasure to be here in October, meeting a few of colleagues here and now well-known faces in this room. So we also caught up with our stakeholders, FSA, the SSBJ, which I want to commend for their work because you were not commended before. So thank you, Nobu, for what you have started to do with your own board. I think it's terrific. Japan is leading the way now to, in terms of defining precise timelines for their work on the standard setting, and this is based on the global baseline. So congratulations and thank you for the contribution to the global baseline because of that. We also met, as Erkki said, the Prime Minister, but also the METI Minister, the Commissioner of FSA with colleagues. So, and this morning, CEOs, I was with you meeting CEOs of large companies. So a very, very full agenda, and thank you again for the participation in our activities here.
Well, thank you for that short summary of what you've been up to. So I think Jean-Paul gave a very good description of the journey that you've been going through since COP26. I just want to go back a bit. When the exposure drafts were released early last year in March, there was a consultation period. I think the SEC said they received 16,000 comments, and I have 1,400 comment letters. So if there were 10 in each, it's about the same number of comments. So could you sort of give us some of the major feedbacks that you got and any decisions you made based on those comments?
Thank you, Keiko. Well, first of all, I think we received a lot of positive feedback about the work that has been prepared, to start with by the Technical Readiness Working Group, and then the prototype that was presented at COP26, then that was issued as an ED after deep, thorough work for several months between October, November, and March. So I think that was overall saying there is support for what was presented here. I think a number of reasons for that, obviously, but certainly the fact that we embedded TCFD so profoundly was a very reassuring factor for many, and also providing reference to a framework that has some form of consensus in the sustainability area and certainly in the climate area. Among the adjustments that we made on the fundamental general requirements, we really played around in the redeliberation the notion of what is a value chain and how deep do you need to go into your value chain. So on one way, you could say we've simplified the work of preparers by removing the word significant in looking at all significant risks and opportunities. But there was a risk of confusion with the notion of material that we are using for other purposes. So the word all was remaining, which looks, very impressive if you want to work with that. And that's where I would second Jean-Paul in, I think, the relief that indeed we felt was needed by providing what we borrowed actually from the IFRS accounting world, which is this notion of supportable and reasonable information without undue cost or effort, which we applied to this notion of exploring the value chain. So that was one. And the other one on S1 was putting back into the ED in December last year, the integrated reporting framework. And I'm saying that in particular in this Japanese audience because there are so many users of the integrated reporting framework in this country. We hope that in Japan, the fact that ISSB is TCFD, gap agnostic, and integrated reporting should support an easier adoption here by preparers. On the climate side, we reviewed in detail the greenhouse gas emissions calculations, in particular scope 3, which obviously is not an easy part, but we were really told by more and more preparers, and even this morning again, that for some companies here, 90% of their greenhouse gas emissions and therefore the risks on transition, climate transition, are in scope 3 upstream. And on the other side, for electronics company this morning, that was 90% was at the customer and the consumer level. So without that, you're basically missing most of what would be meaningful. So we confirmed the fact that the scope 3 would be mandated, but we later, or at the moment we did that in October, we also said that we would develop guidance and proportionality aspects to go with that one. Another thing was financed emissions, on which we, on the contrary, we confirmed financed emissions, but we decided to remove facilitated emissions on the basis that methodology was still under development and maybe for further considerations. So there's been a mix of confirming with support or maybe sometime just taking things out of our standards.
Thank you. So one thing that actually I think was mentioned that you didn't was that you dropped the word enterprise value somewhere along the line. And I think that's for some people, and I don't know if you use the word materiality, because I'm often asked, so is it single or double? And because I can't answer, I say it's ISSB materiality, which doesn't really mean much, but it's not the wrong answer. So if I were to ask that you drop the word enterprise value, what does that mean? What was intended by that?
Yes, as you said, at some point in time, and that point was very precise actually, it's when we started to work with our colleagues in Europe on interoperability, because the word enterprise value in Europe has a very strict legal term which does not correspond to the meaning that we're using in the IFRS Foundation and overall literature. So we were concerned that there would be confusion about that. Instead of that, we did, I think, something which is pretty powerful and simple, which is borrow again directly from the IFRS accounting definition of materiality, the entity materiality assessment, which is in IAS1. So that is not ISSB materiality. This is the IFRS materiality, which is an investor focus, obviously. So that I think brought a lot of clarity, and today I think we get a lot of positive feedback for having done that.
Thank you. So you talked about scope 3, and you talked about why it's really important, and you also talked about proportionality. And I think there might be some misunderstanding about what you mean by proportionality. And some when I talk to corporates, they express their concern for disclosing Scope 3 for two reasons. One is that it's difficult and almost impossible. And the second is they need to disclose it at the same time as their financial disclosure. So there's 2 points to that. And when you mention proportionality, in a country like Japan, what does that imply? And when you say that you need to disclose at the same time, I think it's something related to the connectivity that was discussed before. But if you can share your thoughts on those 2 points.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Keiko. Well, as I just said, when we confirmed quite early in the process of redeliberation that Scope 3 would stay as part of what we require, we also committed to develop scalability, proportionality, and guidance about that. So that is what we did essentially in January. So we came up with what I think is a pretty forceful package of support in that. The first is the same as I just mentioned before. This notion of without undue cost or effort, is clearly rooted in the idea that what you need to do has to be done in a manner which is commensurate with the situation of your business. It's an entity assessment. It's for management and boards to assess, and I think putting this back under the table is certainly something that we believe is important for anything, but in particular as well for Scope 3. The second aspect is that we borrowed from the very rich guidance from TCFD and others about how to build a Scope 3 notion, and we developed actually quite practical guidance for companies when they're looking at what are the criteria that they need to look at on primary data versus secondary data, and what to do about verification or not verified data, etc., because we know that Scope 3 language will need to be learned over time. So for instance, we said that not only for Scope 3, basically, you can use ranges, you can use estimates, you can re-update those estimates, but it's much better to be probably on a range of 5 or 10%, but not miss 90% of the problem. So the idea is this is a new language, and we will not learn the language without everyone speaking the language. Of course, we will not be fluent to start with, but we need to do that with protections. So developing those protections and those guidance and educational material is what we are doing right now as we finalize the standards, with also illustrative examples. To your questions about the timing of reporting, yes, we had that conversation with colleagues from the FSA in particular, with the SSBJ as well, through a technical meeting that we had earlier this week. We understand that this limitation of 3 months here in Japan is very demanding. First, as much as for Scope 3, we've provided for a 1-year relief from the effective date for companies and preparers to get their processes and control in order to meet that requirement. Yet we insist on this simultaneous timing because the consumption of the sustainability disclosures and the financial statements should be done at the same time if we want that to be decision useful for investors. In particular, because we are flagging the notion of current and anticipated effects on the financial statements of sustainability risks and opportunities, and to start with climate. So you need to be able to look at the whole package together, and therefore this is why the simultaneous timing is so important and rooted into our fundamental principles. And again, there is a 1-year grace period and relief in the compliance with our standards. And then I would add, and probably echoing the first panel here, that will be jurisdictions' decisions as to the speed at which they want to go into this. But also, if I look at the market here, where the prime market has most of the large companies, we're discussing in other jurisdictions, and the fact that probably not all listed companies should be submitted immediately to those. In Europe, there are conversations about as well, how deep this should be going and how fast this should be going. All of this is not for us to decide. This is ultimately, we're providing a product that it's entirely for jurisdictions to decide under their local conditions what actually makes sense, because ultimately that needs to be decision useful for investors. In addition to that, there is the voluntary adoption. I think Paul mentioned that in the US, quite likely there could be a voluntary adoption before there is a regulatory support or adoption. And for this, we're providing this relief that companies can adopt, but this is voluntary. So if they want to wait, they can wait.
Thank you. So it was announced that by the end of June, you will be releasing S1, S2, so we all have something to look forward to. But in terms of agenda going forward, in December, you released 4 potential topics. So what is the procedure going forward? And I think our Prime Minister mentioned about human capital. How would that be integrated in the work that you've already done, or is it going to be a total separate item?
Yes, we were tasked to start with climate, but very clearly not climate only. And this is to be true with that mission that we were given, that we are going to launch in the next couple of months a request for information about what should be our next stages of work indeed. And the staff has recommended, and we've preliminarily discussed with the board, indeed 4 topics, among which human capital. The search for those topics and the identification of those topics is really related to what we've heard from our advisory bodies and groups, including the Sustainability Consultative Committee that we have. I would say also the jurisdictional working group that was formed to discuss around topics and issues at ISSB, the Advisory Council of ISSB, but also the consultation that we had, the consultation that the trustees made that led to the creation of ISSB, and even before that, the recommendation made by the Technical Readiness Working Group in 2020. So all of that material has been brought into the proposed selection of those 4 topics, among which there is human capital. We have had already discussions with both the government here, the Prime Minister, the METI, about this, but certainly with the FSA and the G7 team of the FSA, because we were blessed so far with a lot of support from G20 and from G7. As I think Erkki alluded to, it is very important that now the presidency is with Japan. The Kishida administration project here about new capitalism is obviously a very consistent view of what we are developing on sustainability in addition to financial statements. And so the leadership of Japan as a country for the presidency of G7 is incredibly timely for the launch of our standards a few weeks after this meeting in now 77 days of G7 here in Japan. So we are very honored to have been tasked in supporting in our own way the work of G7 and the introduction of human capital as part of our consultation. And Lee White, the executive director of the foundation, will be attending a meeting with the delegates of the Minister of Finance of G7 in a few weeks' time here in Japan to ensure that it happens.
Thank you. So I think I have one last question. So we have the Oceania office in Tokyo, and I think it's been reported that Beijing will also be hosting an office. So we will have 2 offices in Asia, and Asia is, I'm sure, a very important part of the world for the ISSB. So what do you is there anything that you are expecting the 2 offices to do, or what are your expectations?
Well, maybe I can bring another expectation. There may be one day more offices than just those in the region, because we believe that the multi-location model is one that is grounded into the idea that the sovereign situations and the cultures of countries and their consensus are probably even more important to take into account when it comes to sustainability than for financial statements. And that doesn't mean that one office or the other is more important, but again, the granularity of our presence, let alone in probably Africa one day, Latin America probably as well, is fundamental for us, one way or the other. So we are very committed to the presence and the role of the Asia-Oceania office. My colleague Taeyong Paik, who is from Korea, is actually based here. We know that there is a group of jurisdictions that the Japanese regulator is having locally here in the region, and we'd like to be part of supporting that group from the Asia-Oceania office here. So there is ample room for the continuation of our long-term partnership with the Japanese regulators and markets here in supporting the development of sustainability disclosures here in the region.
So thank you very much. I think we've ran out of time. As a trustee, I am very honored to work with you, and I hope you come back to Japan again soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Keiko.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faber and Ms. Tashiro, for the great interview session. And so this concludes the special interview. It passed to the global baseline. So we will now have the break until 4:30 p.m. So the program will resume at 4:30 p.m. Thank you for your patience.